Hello to those of you joining us. Thank you so much. We'll start in just a moment. Hello, welcome to everyone joining us. Thank you for being here. We'll start in just a moment. All right, welcome. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. My name is Brianna Mobby. I am the Program Officer for Women, Peace, and Security at the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice, which is located at the University of San Diego's Kroc School. The core of the Kroc IPJ mission is to co-create learning with peacemakers, learning that is deeply grounded in the lived experience of peacemakers around the world, that is made rigorous by our place within a university ecosystem, and that is immediately and practically applied by peacemakers to end cycles of violence. Thank you for joining us here today for this event on flexible, accessible, and equitable funding for women peacemakers. Today, we will hear from experts about how to create better funding processes. And this event brings together partners from two programs, both the Women Peacemakers program hosted here at the Kroc IPJ and the She Wins program, which we're proud to implement in partnership with Search for Common Ground. I'll give you a little bit of background to these programs and a little bit of background of what we're talking about today, and I'm pleased to turn it over to our expert speakers. Since 2002, the Kroc IPJ has hosted the Women Peacemakers Fellowship Program. The fellowship offers a unique opportunity for women peacebuilders to engage in a cycle of learning, practice, research, and participation that strengthens peacebuilding partnerships. The fellowship facilitates impactful collaborations between women peacebuilders from conflict-affected communities and international partner organizations. The fellows also co-create research intended to shape the peacebuilding field and highlight good practices for peacebuilding design and implementation. Today, we'll hear from two of the fellow authors of the Investing in Equity, Creating Equitable Funding for Women Peacebuilders report, which we published in 2022. As I mentioned, we are proud to partner with Search for Common Ground to implement the U.S. Department of State's Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues project, She Wins, which stands for Supporting Her Empowerment, Women's Inclusion, and New Security. The She Wins project directly supports traditionally marginalized women-led organizations in specific target countries and is aided by an advisory group of women peacemakers from around the world. Today, we'll be hearing from one of those advisory group members, as well as Sharmila Shuprasad, who manages the Search for Common Ground She Wins team. She Wins is a $5.2 million five-year program that equips women-led organizations to overcome barriers and participate in peace processes and decision-making. A key tool within this work is the Rapid Response Fund, which was launched in November 2022, which provides agile funding to groups advancing the role of women peacebuilders. We're all here today because we know that securing funding is an ongoing challenge for women-led organizations and women peacebuilders. According to the global study on the implementation of United Nations Security Council 1325, published in 2015, only 2% of aid to peace and security interventions in fragile states and economy targeted gender equality as a principal objective. And OECD data show that in 2012 through 2023, only $130 million out of $31.8 billion in aid went to women's equality organizations and institutions. A 2020 UN Women report found that the share of bilateral aid dedicated to programs related to gender equality and women's rights in conflict-affected and fragile countries decreased to 4.5%. And of total bilateral aid targeting fragile countries from 2017 to 2018, 0.2% went directly to women's rights organizations. In addition to these staggering numbers, many funding partnerships are still top-down. They lack trust and they struggle to value local expertise. This is often reflected in how funding cycles fail to include the knowledge and experiences of women peacebuilders. This reality results in an information gap that ultimately leads to less effective peacebuilding efforts and prevents donors from achieving their investment goals at the same time. Today, we will hear from people who are changing that system and filling that gap, working to provide more flexible funding to women peacebuilders around the world. So thank you so much for being with us. I am happy to introduce Jennifer Bradshaw to give our opening remarks. Jennifer is the Women, Peace, and Security Monitoring and Evaluation and Learning Lead at the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues at the U.S. Department of State. Her portfolio of work focuses on supporting current and emerging WPS projects globally. She has also previously worked with the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice. Welcome back, Jennifer. Amnesty International and USAID, addressing gender integration, access to justice, economic empowerment, and the rule of law in conflict and fragile contexts, such as Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, and Ukraine. Jennifer holds a Master of Science in Peace and Conflict Research from Uppsala University, a Master of Arts in Sociology and Political Science from the University of Oregon, and is a Rotary Peace Fellow. Jennifer is the perfect person to open our event because she is an expert on both the partnerships we're talking about today. She led the work on the Investing in Equity report along with our panelist Ruth Emo-Surratt, and she now oversees the She Wins project as part of her role at the Department of State. Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Brianna, and thank you everyone for joining us from all corners of the globe. It is such a privilege to be able to have this conversation and share the stage with my fellow co-authors of the report, Ruth and Mozara, and then Sharmila, our fearless leader of She Wins over at Search for Common Ground. As Brianna briefly shared in my previous life chapter, I had the privilege of collaborating with a phenomenal group of women peace builders and funders to co-author the Investing in Equity report. Through this report, we were really trying to explore and develop evidence for how do you build equitable funding. We hear a lot of these terms of equitable or local or bottom up and grassroots, but for us, it was important to try to start to operationalize that. So what does that actually mean? What does that actually take? How do we do equitable funding? As Brianna also mentioned, I am currently now taking all those phenomenal learnings that I developed at the Kroc Institute and was able to learn from and with women peace builders and then glean the evidence from this report, and a part of now the Department of State, the Secretary of Global Women's Issues Office, where I get to work specifically with a portfolio that focuses on women and peace and security issues. It's a global portfolio. It ranges from Yemen to Papua New Guinea to Guatemala to the Democratic Republic of Congo. So really spanning the globe because we have so much work to do in multiple areas. A little bit more about what we call SGWE. We also focus on women's economic security and gender-based violence. So we have 3 portfolios of work. But throughout our work as the funding branch of the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, we're constantly looking at how do we do better as it relates to more flexible funding, more locally driven funding, meeting our partners where they're at on the front lines, and also, understanding their contexts are constantly changing. And so our funding and how we fund and how we partner with our funders must also be evolving and changing. So today our conversation comes at an incredibly challenging time. We really have to sit with, women around the world continue to face tremendous barriers that seem at times insurmountable when it comes to the work they're doing, to accessing funds. The UN Gender Snapshot of 2023 warns that if current trends continue, over 340 million women and girls, an estimated 10% of the world's female population, will live in extreme poverty by 2030. In addition, the number of women and girls in conflict-affected contexts has risen significantly, in 2022 reaching 614 million. So that's 50% higher than the number in 2017. So while these global challenges and transnational threats we face have drastically changed over the years, our approaches to achieving stability, to driving peace, especially the Department of State, must continue to evolve, as I mentioned, and meet the needs and the perspectives of local women and girls. So this, I think, is also an exciting time because we're seeing the WPS field responding to these incredible challenges. In particular, there's a growing body of evidence around this topic today of how do we fund better? How do we be more locally driven? How do we be flexible in our funding? And for example, the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund just released a report that focused on, channeling more sufficient funds, longer term funds, flexible funds, highlighting these really key approaches again to how do we realize supporting women peace builders in a more effective way. And evidence is underscoring the findings from our investing in equity report that was, almost 4 years ago that was published, such as building direct relationships between funders and organizations on the ground. Too often there's this giant delta. And it's even good intentioned people are when you're so removed from the field and the actual work happening on the ground as funders, we miss key things. We don't understand how we could be doing our best work. So closing that delta, having events like today, having these conversations, but even building deeper relationships with our partners on the ground is absolutely vital. The other thing that I, found was really important that came from that equitable and funding report, and I think is still highly relevant, is funders have to be ready to take risks. And I know there's this feeling where we start to get a little tense in our stomachs, even I'd say at the US, government level, take risks, funding, money. It's an uncomfortable thing to be saying and having to live into. That being said, we're not going to figure out how to do things better and more effectively if we're not willing to take risks. And as we all know, risks can be scary and challenging, but also so rewarding. There's so much rich learning that emerges when we're ready to push the barrier and go into new spaces. And that's one of the things with the She Wins Rapid Response Fund, which I know Sharmila will speak more to, is doing. And we're finding a mechanism to be able to do that. And again, because of it, we're gleaning such powerful insights and learnings, and then also being able to support new organizations, emerging organizations that have never really received substantial funding before, but absolutely should, because they are incredible leaders in their space. One of the other key findings, don't worry, I'm not going to go into the whole laundry list, but that just stood out to me was the decision for funding priorities still too often falls in the hands of staff of the organizations, of the funders. And so we need to make sure that how we're funding, who we're funding, our focus areas is really still driven by the people that are receiving the funds. And that's one of the things that I've just always valued and so deeply appreciated about the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice is they listen, they take the time to learn, they create those spaces to hear from women peace builders directly, being like, well, what do you need funding for? How can we support you better? And then they respond and act. And that's that's my next really big point, is that evidence is not enough. And I hate to say it, but I feel like we have a ton of evidence right now, a strong evidence base for why women, and yes, we need to fund them more. But what we need to actually start to do is, put our money where our mouth is, if I were to use kind of the appropriate term right now, is, okay, so we have the evidence, now it's time to fund women. And that's an exciting period, I'd say, for the US in particular, as it relates to that the Biden and Harris administration is attributing a record $2.6 billion in the fiscal year of 2023 in foreign assistance to advance gender equality. This is doubling our prior year commitments. And then in the fiscal year 2024, we're looking at increasing that to $3.1 billion in funding for gender equality. And at SG, we have supported the administration in its commitment to expand the Department of State and USH gender equality assistance resources through our programming. And as we know, programming and funding is really one of the first ways, global community and international community is having an opportunity to support and intervene in conflicts. So our programs have a tremendous impact. Despite a relatively small foreign assistance budget, in the past year, 95 human rights organizations, of which 70 were women-led organizations, were trained and supported by SGW's assistant. Now we know money isn't everything. It doesn't hurt to have money, but how we fund and who we fund is critical. It's something I've mentioned before already, but I want to sort of dive into that a little bit more. And through the Rapid Response Fund that She Wins has realized, we are now able to fund up to $2 million on a global level to local community-led organizations. And we've had some great reflection sessions around this particular mechanism about what's working well, what's not. And one of my key takeaways is flexible funding, yes, but we also have to think about flexible processes. We have to think about flexible ecosystems that surround this funding, because it can't just be the money that we're flexible around. It has to be the entire, like I said, system and ecosystems that are surrounding how we're distributing these funds. And, Sharmila is going to share a little bit more about our particular projects and where they are emerging, and what we're learning from our Rapid Response Fund. But we've had some really great partnerships growing in places like Guatemala and Kyrgyzstan. And through that funding, we're able to fund organizations, like I mentioned, that haven't received large amounts of funds. And Search for Common Ground is doing a phenomenal job of just rolling up their sleeves, really partnering with these organizations to make sure they have the capacity they need to receive larger funds. And so that they in the future can, have that ability to not just receive funds from us, but from others. And as we know, that creates a little bit more sustainability. So, I really want to make sure I don't take up too much time, and we get to hear from our phenomenal experts, Ruth and Moserat and Sharmila today, who have just really been living and breathing the efforts of the Rapid Response from She Wins and just realizing flexible funding. But before I close out, I really want to say, if the US can do better with flexible funding, if we can create mechanisms like the She Wins Rapid Response Fund, then there's really no excuses. Others can follow. We're in a huge, giant system over at the US government. So if we can do this, others can. And I'm incredibly grateful for our partnerships and relationship with the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice and Search for Common Ground, because really at the heart of all this work, it's the people, it's our relationships, it's our partnerships. And if those aren't strong and healthy, then the rest can't follow. And so I'm happy to just be able to share that our relationships and our funding and how we're approaching it are strong and vital and healthy. And Brianna and Sharmila, you are a force to reckon with. Same with you, Moserat and Ruth. And we're just forever grateful for the work you're doing and how you're realizing more flexible funding on the ground and being willing to take risks with us at the State Department. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for your leadership across these programs and for being with us today. I'm happy to introduce Sharmila Shuprasad, whose leadership I'm so grateful for in the She Wins project. Sharmila and the Search for Common Ground team are leading the way to create flexible funding, often through intensive, personalized support to peacemakers. Sharmila Shuprasad leads Search for Common Ground's global policy and women, peace, and security portfolios, bringing over 18 years of international experience in gender, humanitarian, and peace-building programming. Sharmila is currently the project director of Search's She Wins project, the 5-year global initiative focused on equitable financing for local women's groups and advancing women, peace, and security. She started her career in Thailand and Indonesia. For over 5 years, she led parliamentary advocacy efforts on women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. She advanced women's rights advocacy regionally, including through policy research and analysis at UNFPA. Originally from Toronto, Canada, Sharmila holds a master's in international development from Dalhousie University and a bachelor's in women's studies from York University. Welcome, Sharmila.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Brianna, and thanks thanks to you for organizing this event. It's really wonderful to be here. And thanks, Jen, for your kind words. I will try to be brief because I know that we have 3 amazing panelists coming after me. So the She Wins project is a global program, as we heard, which covers a few different countries: Cameroon, CAR, Uzbekistan, Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Lebanon, and eventually we'll cover Somalia and Guatemala, and regionally in Central Asia as well. We're also currently running 15 projects in 12 countries with our Rapid Response Fund. What's interesting about the She Wins project is the linkage with the Investing in Equity report, because when we were designing this program some years ago, we were trying to connect that research into practice, looking at issues around equitable financing for women peace builders, looking at issues around decolonizing aid, and looking at how to create an evidence base of how this could work as a case study example of equitable financing. And so we're now about 2.5 years into this project. And we've had some really interesting learnings in terms of how to approach these issues around how to create equity in how we finance local women peace builders. So I'll tell you 4 things that we did, which contributed to supporting small WPS movements in conflict-affected places. So the first thing that we did was that we recognized that a lot of funding coming into women, peace, and security spaces within the women's movement engenders competition. It creates competition among different women's groups. So we wanted to put a process in place where women's groups will get together, collaborate on designing their initiatives, and everybody in the room will leave with the understanding that they will be funded through the project. So we did a lot of mapping and analysis in advance so that we can invite groups into the room who we've already decided to fund before we get to the stage of the design and the co-design of projects. So for example, in Uzbekistan, the Fergana Valley, we worked with very small women's groups, and most of the projects were actually joint between 2 or 3 women's organizations, where a more well-capacitated small organization mentored the other, even smaller organizations to collaboratively use the funds to do women, peace, and security work. The second thing that we really paid attention to was the absorptive capacity. So when I say absorptive capacity, I mean, how much funding can an organization absorb, a small organization absorb, without causing internal issues within that organization? This often involves working with organizations that are this is often an important thing to think about when working with very, very small organizations that maybe 1 or 2 staff members, and so on. So just understanding how much funding we can really offer to organizations. In some places it's $5,000, in some places it's $20,000, and in some places it's more. But understanding that is a really important first step. The third thing is around leaving organizations after designing programming with the capacity for them to leverage that work to secure additional funding from other sources when because of the way that the cycles of programming works. Organizations still need to have that capacity to leverage additional funds afterwards. So we've had the most success in the Central African Republic with this, where we've worked with very small groups who've received around $5,000 in funding. And because of that work, they have been able to show their capacity to other donors and to secure funding from other donors, based on the work that they've done with our project. So that's a real sort of leaving organizations with the capacity to do that. And then the fourth thing I'll talk about is building out Search for Common Ground as an international organization to build our own capacity to manage this type of micro grant in an equitable way. So we do fixed amount awards where organizations can report based on deliverables. We're trying to sort of reduce the amount of complex reporting and complex paperwork that organizations need to do in order to receive this funding, even though this funding does come from the State Department originally. So this meant a lot of sort of reflection on our own internal procedures. And for us, as Jen mentioned, to understand how we undertake risk and how we work with groups that are receiving very, very small amounts of money, but who also have limited capacity in terms of managing large quantities of funding. And so for us to leave groups in a better place, for them to be able to have built some skills to manage funds that are coming in. I want to close with talking about 3 things that we learned. One, I think we learned that we can, as an international organization, act as a catalyst towards the women, peace, and security space in some of the most conflict-affected places in the world. So not necessarily as a sub-grantor, although that is what we are doing. What we've learned is that we can catalyze local groups around their increasing their visibility, increasing their connections internationally, and increasing their ability to raise funds based on the projects that they want to implement. For example, in both the Central African Republic and in Uzbekistan, the groups that we worked with went on to form networks where they're connecting with each other even after we close out. And they want to do that. They've chosen to come together and form networks together where they can learn from each other. They can continue to work together in future programming and so on. So we can act as that catalyst to create a small movement within some of these spaces, even though we're, what we're essentially doing is sub-granting. The second learning for us through this project is that we actually continue to underestimate as a field how important mental health is. So in the project, we provided mental health and psychosocial support to participants from our various local partners and their participants. But what we didn't realize was how much we needed to provide this kind of support to the local women's groups themselves. So for example, we had mental health professionals do a survey with the groups that we worked with in the Central African Republic, and we were blown away by just the high percentage of psychological stress, PTSD, suicidal thoughts, and so on that were reported by the women in the organizations that we were working with. So we realized that even, I think that that's something that we often build into programming to provide to participants. What we really learned is that we need to provide that kind of support to the women's groups themselves who are at the front lines of doing this work. And that's something that we need to mainstream throughout the project. The last thing I'll talk about is something that we've been advocating for a very long time, and which we attempted to build into this project. We need to provide core support for organizations. A lot of donor funding comes in and it's for activities. So you must deliver on these activities and the funding must be spent in the delivery of these particular trainings or workshops or whatever. But the core support for the finance system or the HR person that knows how to deal with complex HR human resources issues and so on. The sort of structure of the organization also needs to have support, and that's not project funding usually. It's what normally organizations have as overhead funding. For smaller organizations, I think that we need to build a lot of core support, because that's sometimes what organizations need, is the flexibility to be able to do their work, strengthen their organizations, and have that core support to support their salaries, their running costs, their overhead, their management, and so that they can invest back into the strengthening of the organization. And that's something that we've often tried to build in to some of this funding, where we're not necessarily only expecting activities after activities, but we're supporting a movement, we're supporting a sector around women, peace, and security. And that's what we need to do in order to make that change happen, and to invest well in women's peace building work. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Brianna. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I'm really excited to hear what our panelists, what our other panelists have to say about this.
Thank you so much, Sharmila, for your leadership of the She Wins work and the whole search team. And thank you for being here today. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists, 3 incredible peacemakers who will speak about their experiences and expertise related to equitable and flexible funding processes. After the panel, we'll take questions from the audience, both for the 3 panelists I'm about to introduce and for Sharmila, so please put your questions in the Q&A box. Our first panelist is Ruth Buffalo, who is originally from Mandaree, North Dakota. She is a citizen of the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation and a descendant of the Chiricahua Apache. She is CEO of the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. In 2018, she was elected to serve her first four-year term in North Dakota's House of Representatives, District 27, during which she introduced new laws focused on addressing human trafficking and resolving the missing or murdered Indigenous persons crisis. Ruth is a public health professional and educator who has held leadership positions with the First Nations Women Alliance, the North Dakota Human Rights Coalition, and the National Native Boarding School Healing Coalition, among others. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you for having me. Nido Shadzi, Nakbaga O, Madashi, Mia Adesheds, Ma Be Sigids, Madzigidads, Nakbaga O.
Thank you. Our second panelist is Mossarat Kadim, who's the Executive Director of Paimon Alumni Trust, a pioneer organization in preventing and countering violent extremism in Pakistan. Mossarat is an internationally known expert on PCVE, de-radicalization, and WPS. She has published books, articles, and documentaries focused on women building peace and has served as a Minister of Information, and a member of the National Commission on the Status of Women. She's a visiting fellow at the Center for WPS at the London School of Economics. Welcome, Mossarat.
Thank you.
And our final panelist, Nicoline Waze, is a local gender and development expert and a peace builder based in Cameroon. She is the CEO and founder of two local organizations, Pathways for Women's Empowerment and Development, an integrated agricultural training center, PAWEDIAC, aimed at accelerating the achievement of the SDGs using a gender equality and intergenerational approach. She also completed an assessment of the first Cameroon National Action Plan for the implementation of UNSCR 1325 on women, peace, and security. Welcome, Nicoline. Ruth, my first question is for you. In the Investing in Equity report that you co-authored, trust, transparency, and communication were highlighted as characteristics that support equitable funding partnerships. Could you speak a bit about how funders and peace builders can create these types of relationships? How have you seen these characteristics or lack thereof in your work?
Yes, thank you for the question. So I'll first start with the importance of building trust and building relationships. Really, I believe, starts at ground zero. Building relationships in order to have mutual understanding and mutual respect with one another. We have to understand each other's backgrounds, each other's lived experiences. And in my case, being a member or being a woman, Indigenous woman, Native American, American Indian, these homelands that we call of present day United States of America, these are our homelands. And so we don't have anywhere else to go. We can't flee to Ireland or Britain or, Europe. This is it for us. These are our homelands. And if you understand what that means in a historical context, myself being a Hidatsa woman, we are born into a unique political relationship with the United States federal government. At one point in time, we were housed underneath the Department of War within the United States, within the Department of State of the United States. And so there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of tragedy. As you mentioned, I'm the president of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, where we are working to bring healing to our communities. But oftentimes people tell us, get over it, why, what are you crying for? You should be happy that you have crumbs for funding. A lot of our tribal nations have been extremely underfunded for decades, and we still continue to be underfunded. And so when we talk about the intersections of women peace building, oftentimes that is not a part of our vocabulary, even though it is inherent with us, because it is directly linked to our survival. If you look back into the policies, for example, of the United States and the federal government's harmful policies to completely decimate our population from the face of this planet, this comes from different harmful policies, such as the assimilation policies, Dawes Act, and a lot of those remnants are here today. I echo the words of the previous speakers in that we are oftentimes pitted against one another because we are essentially fighting over crumbs, very minimal funding. And so how do we build relationships? How do we build trust? We have to start at ground zero and understanding each other's histories. So understanding histories, to me, in my view, is to really go upstream, go to the root causes. And what are the root causes? Well, in my case, in my people's case, we are not supposed to be here today. We have different policies that track our bloodline. For example, we are the only human race that is tracked in the same manner as dogs and horses, based off of our degree of Indian blood. And these were harmful policies put in place by the United States federal government that are still in existence today. Today, we talk about, it's equal pay day today, March 12th, for women. And so, coincidentally, we're having this panel, which is great. And I also want to say thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. But, these are hard truths, hard conversations that not everybody wants to hear, not everybody wants to have because they don't want to be uncomfortable. Well, simply put, we've been uncomfortable for centuries. And so for Native Americans, we make 59 cents of the dollar as compared to non-Hispanic white men. This is another form of erasure. Whereas women overall earn 84 cents for every dollar. And so even equal pay day highlights up to 1.2 million salary shortfalls for women of color. And if we take it a step further on that note, even within the White House, there is a gender pay gap. And so difference of administrations, yes, tiny minuscule improvements, but hopefully we can live to see these changes that we all need and deserve. For example, women working in the White House earn 80 cents for every dollar men earned in 2023, a gap wider than the national average. So when we talk about how do we improve these systems for women's peace builders, we got to look at the root causes, and we also got to look in our own backyards of the United States of America. Because quite honestly, I know a lot of the other countries globally use the United States model on how they mistreated the original peoples of these lands, the Native Americans. So how the United States mistreated Native women, especially, we are the backbone of our nations. Other countries are replicating this model on how to continue genocide within their countries. So we have a lot of work to do, but again, building trust and building relationships, we have to have those hard conversations in order to move forward so that we don't continue to repeat the same issues. I was an appointed member of the Not Invisible Act Commission that was introduced by Secretary Holland, the Department of Interior's secretary, when she was in Congress. And the commission was brought together to address the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis. So still today within our own homelands, we continue to be erased. We continue to be invisible. So lots of work there. So thank you. I will end there. Madzigidads. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Monserrat, my next question is for you. You're also a co-author of the Investing in Equity report. And that report argues that creating more equitable partnerships positively impacts peace-building projects. Could you share how you've seen this happen? Oh, you're muted, Monserrat.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me, Brianna, and it was good to actually hear my friend from the fellowship, Ruth. As always, she has been very straightforward in her opinion and in her talks. Thank you for inviting me to this very important panel. You asked me about my personal experience of equitable partnership. I would say my experience is incredible because the first thing that I experienced was when the donors, I mean, my partner organizations who acts as a donor, instead of referring to us as implementers, recognize us as independent expert partners. You know what it does? It instills in me and my other colleagues a sense of confidence and motivation. Again, when our donor and partner that they trust in and respect us, that means that the local partner's wisdom, judgment, and assessment of the needs in our communities and our understanding of the conflict is respected by by our partner, that is by the donor. It leads to a more effective peace program intervention, which is really based on reality and, of course, evidence. Again, I think we just say we know that the equitable partnerships are built upon principles of mutual respect, transparency, and shared decision making. This signifies a mutual acknowledgement of the complementary strengths and expertise that each brings to the whole process. This recognition underscores the importance of genuine collaboration in realizing the impactful and sustainable outcomes in conflict-affected contexts. And it is encouraging that such effective funding models and mechanisms exist. And when I say my partner or the donor with whom I have been working for the last almost 12 years is ICANN, which is an independent international organization. It provides its multi-donor innovative fund, IPF, offers small to medium-sized grants and technical support globally to women peace building organization. This is the example that I am quoting because this is the experience that I can share. I mean, this is my experience, which, like I said, has been remarkable. And one of the key ways in which I always say that this sort of equitable partnership positively, I would say, impact the peace building project is because it ensures that the interventions are contextually relevant and responsive to the needs of the local community. And from my own experience, I can say that by involving like the local partner, the local NGO, or the grassroots women-led organization in the designing of the project, its implementations, the donors can actually leverage their deep understanding of the local dynamics, its culture, and the challenges. So this localized knowledge enhances the effectiveness and sustainability of any peace building interventions. Again, I would just say, using my own example, equitable partnership has the transformative potential. Because in our case, it contributed to my organization's capacity building, that is PAMAN's capacity building, and institutional strengthening. So it enabled us to take on larger role in preventing violent extremism and peace building effort more, I would say, effectively and efficiently. And the success stories that we share are because of the partnership, the equitable partnership that we have been in with ICANN for the last 12 years, like I said. Now, what it has done, it has not only fostered greater self-reliance and sustainability or in our initiative, but it has also promoted the long-term resilience of our peace-building work in the face of evolving challenges. It gives us flexibility. We need to respond to the needs on the ground and to define our own priorities without being constrained by a rigid project-based funding. And I'll give you an example. During COVID, when we could not carry out our peace-building sessions in the community because of the restrictions, after discussing it with ICANN administration, we diverted our resources to information sharing with communities on the rooftops and distribution of masks and other protection kit and medicine. This could not have been made possible in the donor and implementer partner relationship. So another benefit of the equitable partnership is that it facilitates a more, I would say, balanced distribution of resources and decision-making authority. So it addresses power imbalances that often marginalize local actors in traditional donor-driven approaches. So by co-designing projects and jointly setting priorities, donors and the local NGOs ensure that interventions reflect the diverse perspectives and needs of all stakeholders, particularly those most affected, yet most ignored in the conflict. So this inclusive approach enhances the relevance, effectiveness, and legitimacy of peaceful building efforts, while also promoting social cohesion and reconciliation. Now, to conclude, I would just say that creating more equitable partnerships between donors and NGOs is essential for advancing peace building efforts worldwide. By prioritizing collaboration, inclusivity, and empowerment, these types of partnership foster contextually relevant, sustainable, and effective interventions that address the root causes of conflict and promote long-lasting peace. As we strive to build a more peaceful and just world, let us embrace the transformative potential of equitable partnerships to create positive change in conflict-affected, conflict-prone communities around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Monserrat. Nicolene, my next question is for you. You're a member of the She Wins Advisory Group, which is a group that helps provide guidance across the implementation of that program. Could you speak to the role that flexible funding has on the capacity and reach of Cameroonian women-led organizations, and what specific practices have made this possible?
Thank you, Brianna. Thank you again to the previous speakers. I will start by saying that flexible funding has indeed given us the opportunity to discover another category of incredible leaders in peace building in their own respective spaces and with innovative, creative, and courageous skills that without a flexible funding, we could not discover them. I think among other things within the context of the implementation of the She Wins project in Cameroon, flexible funding has helped this women-led organization, especially the local, at the grassroots, rural area women-led organization, to build and expand their capacities and operations. It has helped them to adapt to their changing needs, because generally the fund, as the name implies, is flexible, which means there is a possibility for it to be reviewed, for it to be revised, for it to be reoriented to meet the challenges, the prevailing challenges, since we are working within the context of an ongoing crisis. So nothing is, the dynamics change every now and then. And this is one of the beautiful things that this funding has done to these women. As I said earlier, it has given this new category of peace builder because it works specifically with new women organizations who do not generally have the financial capacity to meet with all the stringent requirements for funding and application procedure. This is simplified funding procedure that gives exposure and visibility to these young organizations, and equally advance and render the peace building space inclusive and equitable for all stakeholders. As I said earlier, it helps to scale up the operations of these women, of this organization, by helping them address not just traditional peace building needs, but needs that are more pressing more pressing issues that they face in their different communities, which at times, if we want to just follow the original program or project within the lines, we might implement activities that have little or no impact, view the prevailing situation. It gives opportunity to women who necessarily do not have capacity building. Like, it does not make the peace building space limited to women with huge capacity building. Nobody came to this space with capacity. So we all learn capacity in the course of working here. And this flexible funding is such an incredible way of building the capacity of new organizations, and gives opportunity for small organizations that exist within their community, not just big organizations who come and implement prompt activities within the community just because they have financial capacity and want to extend their operations. But here, these are small organizations that live within these communities. They are trusted by these communities. They have been working with these communities over the times. And when they bring projects, they are not implementing just prompt projects, but they are staying with the community, implementing the project, monitoring and evaluating to be able to say what the impact, how transformative the projects implemented have been, who have a good mastery of the cultural norms of this society and know how to navigate these cultures without necessarily causing more harm to the communities that are involved. I will also say that flexible funding has also led to collaboration and networking, not only between the funder and the Search for Common Ground and the main implementing organization, Hope for the Advocate, but also between the funder, the main implementing organization, and these women-led organizations, and also local authorities and all other key stakeholders. Because through this funding, these women have made their work known to many local authorities, traditional authorities, administrative authorities, and even religious authority. And this type of network opportunities also provide them with greater opportunities to learn and take collective action, and also facilitate joint efforts by the many different stakeholders that are concerned in this implementation. I would also like to mention adapting to changing needs. Like, they are generally really overlapping. What I am saying are overlapping, because with the flexible funding, these women at the community level are able to respond to quick and emerging challenges. I said that already. They are able to relocate resources towards most relevant and impactful initiatives, ensuring that they stay relevant and effective in their effort to empower and support women. So it has also led to building organizational capacity. These women, as I said earlier, these are young organizations who, because they are faced by a conflict situation and maybe have had the opportunity to engage in different workshops on women, the WPS, UN Security Council Resolution 1325, they now understand that they have a role to play in peace building. And they come home and they create these organizations and networks. And this flexible funding remember, the Search for Common Ground flexible funding within the framework of the She Wins project is not just funding, but capacity building first. They take time to build the capacities of these women, design and write the projects together. It is a type of an onboarding process. It actually onboard these new organizations on how to collaborate within the funding framework and implement project. So it helps in building organizational sustainability, used to strengthen internal capacity of these organizations. When some came to, during our first meeting, some did not even know how to get the project right. But because of the capacity building, they were able to develop their projects, went ahead in the course of implementing, able to revise and even reorient their projects. I think this is what flexible funding done, and also ensures that these women-led organizations are not solely reliant on short-term funding resources. It is not meant to be a prompt act. It is meant to build their capacities from one stage to the other, for them to be able to gain funding from one step to the other. And when we come to specific practices that have been made within the framework of the She Wins project, I'll talk of, there has been, I think, type of communication that is open and transparent, because it takes that communication that is open communication, effective communication, and transparent communication for partners to come together with such diversified capacities and work together on the same project, building the capacities of one another and learning from one another. The women were open to the funders about their challenges and their limitations, and that is why the funders were able to tailor capacity building trainings that help them to meet their needs. There is also
I'm sorry, Nicolene, thank you so much. I think we have to make sure we get our other questions in. If you have just a moment to wrap up or give your final thought here.
Okay, I just have one more point to make. I was talking about equal decision making and mutual respect and trust, which Mosarat has already belabored, and accountability, and like a type of fair and effective conflict resolution, because in those early stages of a relationship or a partnership, there will always be conflict resolution, but the conflict is resolved effectively and fairly. And of course, the continuous learning and improvement process is what is really the backbone of that type of flexible funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolene. I have one more question for all three of our panelists, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. So please feel free to add your questions in that Q&A box for our three panelists here, as well as Sharmila. So for our panelists, and we'll start with Ruth, what is one thing that funders and donors could do to make funding easier for women peace builders to access? Ruth, please go first.
Yes, thank you for the question. I would say streamlining the processes for accessing funds. We hear this across the board, that oftentimes, you know, I believe Nicolene had mentioned this, you know, the capacity building is important. And so many of so it's hard for me to say women peacemakers or women's peacemakers within the Native American communities, because it's often not a term used domestically. Oftentimes it's our grassroots frontline land defenders, protectors, which is all encompassing of women who are doing the work day in and day out. Oftentimes, we don't have access to capital. We don't have access to a lot of the systems that others might have an inherent access to. So I know Indian Collective has done great work in making access to funds, access to capital more accessible to our very grassroots people, which is the people who are in need the most, which is also the people who are directly impacted. So making these systems less bureaucratic and more accessible to everyday people is so important. Madzigidads, thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. And Mosrat, the same question to you.
I will be very direct. I think they should trust the potential, ability, and expertise of local women-led peace-building organizations. Then they should also create a dedicated funding streams for peace-building work and adopt a broader definition for strategic peace-building or preventing violent extremism that should encompass the intersection between peace, rights, development, and humanitarian interventions. Besides this, the third recommendation, the request or my recommendation is that the whole process should be made very simple, and like we say it should be flexible but simplified. And then it should be long-term funding commitments, because peace building is a long-term process, and it cannot be just addressed through a few years of project. It has to be actually more than 5 years program. This is, I think, what we really are going to ask the donors to make funding easier for women and make it more accessible. The whole process and the bureaucratic, the difficulties should be removed. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nicolene, the same question for you. What's one thing funders could do to make this easier?
I think I go back to my first question is by making funding options flexible, because when funding options are flexible, they will have to remove barriers with regards to paperwork, with regard to, as Ruth has said already, the bureaucracy, providing clear guidelines and instructions. And when funding is flexible, it will make provision for long-term funding, the possibility to conduct midterm reviews, to revise the funding, adjust and reorient the project, thereby enabling organizations to respond to new and emerging needs and on the ground according to their situation. When funding is flexible, it is inclusive, and specific aspects of such funding stream should be dedicated to these women-led grassroots organizations who don't always have funding capacity. And of course, funders can also continue to invest in capacity building initiatives through training programs like Search for Common Ground has done with the project in Cameroon, mentorship opportunities, technical assistance, and making networking platforms available to grassroots women, and of course, foster partnership and collaboration between the women peace builder, other relevant stakeholders, like what I said earlier, and which is operating in Cameroon.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists. Excuse me, I'm sorry, it's early. My voice isn't totally awake yet. And thank you for those of you submitting your questions to the Q&A. Please feel free to continue submitting. Sharmila, we have a question for you. How can we ensure that funding mechanisms are not only flexible, but sustainable in the long term? So how are we thinking about both the rapid side of things or the urgent side of things, but also the long-term and sustainable relationship building side of things as we think about supporting women peace builders?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a dilemma that we're facing within the field of funding for NGOs and international organizations as well, is that we're tied to a funding cycle that is short term, considering the great needs that we're facing and the big change that we want to make as well. At Search, we've patched together portfolios of programming over 20 years to make the change that we need to make, but it's from different donors with different reporting requirements and different evaluation criteria for those projects as well. So it is really, really hard. And right now, I think with a lot of the local groups that we're working with as part of this project, we're trying to enable those groups to be able to get more resources for the work that they've started but haven't finished. It's hard to get to the point where we can say that we've made a big impact if we have 6 months of funding or 9 months of funding or even 5 years of funding sometimes. So sometimes it takes 20 years. And that's the question of sustainability, in terms of sustainability towards making big level change. It's not to say that within 6 months we can't make small changes. We certainly can. It's that the type of change in the women, peace, and security space that we want to make is long-term, and it needs to be sustainable, and the funding needs to back that up. And that's a really important part of what we're trying to do within women, peace, and security space.
Thank you so much. Ruth, the next question is for you, and I'm kind of combining two questions. So the first is about how do we ensure that funding is tailored to the unique context, diverse needs of women peace builders around the world? You spoke a bit about people in your community don't necessarily use the word peace builder, right? There's a range of other terms. And so how do we think about creating flexible funding that hits those communities maybe more effectively, and using a wider range of terms, for example? And then there's a question in the chat about kind of how media can support marginalized groups being seen, particularly by funders or by the broader community. So I'm kind of combining those two, if you're willing to take those.
Sure. Yes. Thank you for the question. Many people still believe, many people who are treaty people, who still are, when I say treaty people, it means that they still are very much in tune and with the treaties that were made with tribal nations centuries ago. And so with that, I also do work with the International Indian Treaty Council, who does work internationally. And so we work to fight for Indigenous people's rights across the globe, but specifically within our own backyard of the present day United States of America. There's so much work that needs to be done to have equity and visibility within the media, within these systems, hence the Not Invisible Act that introduced a commission of 40 individuals, federal partners, non-federal partners, who came together to address the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis that we are continuing to face. We ask many questions, why is there no media coverage? And then also data. Why is there no data? Each state is different. When I was a state legislator in North Dakota, we were able to introduce a missing persons database, but it passed into law without funding, a very small one-time fiscal note of $49,000. But then we were able to, long story short, use the America Rescue Plan Act dollars that each state was allocated within the present day United States. And so we were able to fully fund this missing persons database in North Dakota at the cost or expense of $300,000. But we know without data, there is no story to be told. And so it raises a lot of questions. So I would encourage our allies to ask these questions when you are sitting at these tables of power, to ask, why are we not paying more attention to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous persons? I've heard different comments throughout my career of, well, you're only 1% of the United States population, or you're only 6% of the population in North Dakota. Well, why is that? We are products of genocide, quite frankly. That is why we are such a shrinking representation of people here. And so any violent crime committed against us should be held at the highest level of regard. But quite honestly, it's not. Yes, there have been small incremental changes to get us there, but 84% of Native women will have experienced some form of violence within their lifetime. And that is only going off of what has been reported. There is still a portion of unreported cases or misclassified cases where we are grouped into different populations. So lots of work that needs to be done there. And I hope I answered your question. Maadzagadads, thank you.
Thank you. Most about inequality. And the next question is for both of you. You both spoke a bit about seeing women peace building partners as co-creators, as co-designers in the process, as leaders with expertise. So can you speak a little bit about your experience there and how funders can better involve women peace builders at the decision-making level when thinking about funding choices? Mosrat, we'll have you go first, and then Nicolene.
Yeah, I think because I spoke about ICANN's experience, and whenever they try come up with the request for proposal, they contact the women peace builders, who are usually the members of the network, and then they do the mapping of the issues. So the mapping of the issues is done together. That means whatever the issues, and then we prioritize those issues. And each region, comes up with their own sort of priority issues, and then certain specified activities that can address that issues at that time. So this is how we say that we participate not only on identifying the problems and the issues, the mapping of the issues, prioritizing them, and then coming up with the solutions, because the solution lies with the local people, with the indigenous people. Nobody can actually resolve the problem of Pakistan. It has to be the people living in that country, in that region, in that area, who know how to address, how to resolve the conflict, how to bring in social and economic stability. So this is how we have been engaged by our international partner, that is, in this case, it is ICANN. And then it doesn't end up there. When when you receive the funding, and if we find that the funding, there is some issues, that's obstacles, then there is a room for revision. There is a room for reviewing it and sitting with them together to how to address this now. And then they also take into consideration that the answer should come from us, not from them. So it is not coming from above. It is actually a mutual, I would say, trust and responsiveness net to the each other needs and requirements. And that's why we say it is more, I think, not only equitable, but respectful as well. And it's a recognition of the expertise and the knowledge and the skills of the people who are actually dealing with it on daily basis rather on minute basis. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nicolene.
Thank you, Brianna. Thank you, Musara, my ICANN sister. I'm also a She Build Peace campaigner in Cameroon. Okay, so just in line with what Musara has said, She Wins approach is, as I said earlier, is by giving the WLOs the latitude to identify what their needs are. In this first phase, what we did was we had WLOs which could identify what the needs are, but not know how to put them on project proposals. So Search for Common Ground organized workshops to help them build the proposals, help them develop a logical framework on how to put in their activities and the indicators and all of that. They are the local experts. They have a mastery of what is happening on the ground. So Search for Common Ground left it to them to do their own risk assessment and risk mitigation to design what are the outputs and inputs of their project and what are the expected outcomes and how transformative those outcomes are. What difference does it make? And again, to be effectively present on the ground, Search for Common Ground had this advisory group member that I have the privilege to be one of them. So the advisory group members are there to also guide, like a like a broker between Search for Common Ground and partners and the implementing partners. And again, they had a main implementing partner, which is the Hope Advocate. that help them to select these organizations that have these innovative, creative, courageous, and transformative ideas, but lack the funding capacity. Round tables, 2 round tables were held before the implementation of the project to give the implementing partners a deeper insight of what is expected, how they want the accounting documents to be, accountability, how they want them to be. So like they were not taken ambush by being expected to do what they don't know how to do. They were taught how to do all the things that they are expected to do. And the search for common, the advisory group members are there to give like provide program activities, how the program activities are progressing. And they also, Search for Common Ground also has an office in Cameroon, which is also following up. So you see the collaboration and the network is at different levels in the way that the projects are co-created. There is communication, effective communication to communicate health challenges, the ability to reorient, to revise your programs, since the crises are still ongoing, depending on the conflict dynamics. So I think that is how the co-creation has been so far effective, and we really wish that it will be sustainable.
Thank you, Nicolene. Sharmila, there's a question in the chat about what you spoke about core funding for women peace builders and the importance of funding that, not just activities. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about how the She Wins project has looked at this and how what impact do you think it's had on the partners?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, I mean, we've tried to build it into and not ask a lot of questions, because that's sort of, it's at the, normally it's at this sort of negotiation stage of the funding when organizations get a lot of questions back from donors about, well, why do you need this much in overhead, or why do you need this much to support? So there's a lot of sort of questioning of where funding goes for what, especially non-activity based funding. We've attempted to sort of be a lot more flexible on that, to allow organizations to build that support that they need within the way that we've allocated the funding, in terms of the award types that we're using. Other organizations can do it in different ways, but I think for me it's an issue of the principle of it, that donors need to be behind the concept that local organizations need this amount of core funding to support their own internal organizational needs. So, and I know organizations are doing a lot with a very little amount of funding, but I think we can do better in terms of building that into the way that budgets are structured and the way that that organizations report back on their funding as well. I also want to give a bit of a shout out to the She Wins Rapid Response program. We are accepting applications in 78 countries. I see a question in the chat about organizations wanting to apply. So I can share the link with the attendees in the chat, Brianna, if I'm able to do that. And I'm happy to encourage or for people to reach out about that particular bit of funding that we have for rapid response.
Thank you, Sharmila. I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up, and please do share that link. I think it would be wonderful to put that in the Q&A. Thank you so much to our panelists, our speakers today. Thank you to Sharmila, to Ruth, to Mosrat, to Nicolene, to Jennifer for joining us. I'm so grateful for your time and the perspectives that you shared. I'm just going to wrap us up with a finding from the Investing in Equity report. The team conducted a survey of peace builders and funders, and over 95% of respondents across those two categories said that if equity-based improvements were made to the funding system, the outcomes of local peace building projects would be positively impacted. So Sharmila said people around the world are doing a lot with a little. And so imagine what we could do with greater funding to amazing peace builders around the world. Our panelists today highlighted the need for co-creation and co-leadership, for decision-making and partnership, for mutual respect and building interpersonal relationships. And so thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your challenges, opportunities, and places for hope in this work. And thank you all today for joining us. On the screen, you'll see different codes if you're interested in the different projects we've spoken about. So the first being for us here at the Kroc IPJ, the second for our Women Peacemakers program, and I will flag that applications are currently open for a new cohort of Women Peacemakers, and the She Wins project, including the Rapid Response Fund that Sharmila discussed. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists and speakers. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.